Imagine a ruler so powerful, she turned human lives into disposable objects of pleasure. History often paints queens as delicate figures of grace, wisdom, and elegance. Women draped in jewels, remembered for their poise at royal courts. But behind the curtains of grandeur, some wielded their crowns as weapons, reshaping the bodies and souls of those beneath them. This is not the sanitized story of queens you read in textbooks, where virtue and sacrifice are emphasized. This is the tale buried in whispers, erased from sermons, and shunned from polite conversation, because it reveals a truth too dark for the image of royalty. Tonight, you'll witness the horrifying chapter of a queen whose hunger defied morality, religion, and human dignity. A queen who ordered 100 slaves into her bed, only to discard them by morning. This is the history they never wanted you to know. For centuries, the word queen has conjured a carefully polished image. She is imagined as the radiant centerpiece of the court, a figure adorned in jewels and silks, whose every gesture radiates poise and benevolence. In paintings, queens are mothers to their people, protectors of morality, and icons of chastity and devotion. They stand beside kings not merely as companions but as guardians of refinement, embodying a form of sacred femininity. To schoolchildren, their stories read like moral fables, lessons of loyalty, sacrifice, and grace. They are remembered for their patronage of the arts, their carefully chosen words in moments of crisis, and their ability to soften the harshness of masculine power. But the truth beneath the portraits is far more complicated. Queens were not merely symbolic figures placed on pedestals. They were wielders of real, often devastating influence. Behind the delicate brushstrokes of court artists, behind the rehearsed lines of court chroniclers, lay a darker undercurrent. Ambition sharpened into cruelty, and desire that knew no moral boundaries. Consider the environment in which these queens operated. The court was a world built on theater. Every smile was calculated, every word rehearsed, every gesture recorded for posterity. To survive in such an arena required more than beauty. It required ruthlessness. Queens were surrounded by spies, rivals, and enemies both outside and within their own families. Their power was constantly under scrutiny, their every move watched not just by courtiers but by entire nations. A misstep could mean exile, imprisonment, or worse, execution. In such a world, the myth of the noble queen became less a reflection of reality and more a tool of propaganda. The nobility of queens was often fabricated to mask uncomfortable truths. Many were forced into loveless marriages, their bodies treated as vessels for dynastic heirs rather than their own desires. Yet others, once enthroned, discovered how intoxicating absolute power could be. For some, the role of the queen became an escape from vulnerability, and in that escape, cruelty often took root. They learned to manipulate courtiers, to use alliances like weapons, to silence dissent with calculated coldness. And when unchecked, when no voice dared oppose them, their whims could become law, no matter how grotesque. It is within this context that the queen of our story emerges. While history books may describe her with honorific titles, and portraits may immortalize her as serene and virtuous, whispers tell a different story. These whispers paint her not as the selfless mother of her people, but as a predator cloaked in velvet. Behind the veil of majesty, she exploited the very lives entrusted to her rule. To the public eye, she was regal, presiding over ceremonies, offering blessings, standing as a symbol of unity and strength. Yet within the sealed chambers of her palace, power took a darker form. Here, far from the scrutinizing gaze of her subjects, the queen discarded the ideals of virtue. She treated human beings not as courtiers, not even as subjects, but as flesh to be consumed and cast aside. The maternal figure of legend was, in private, a figure of voracious appetite. This is where the contrast becomes most unsettling. In public, queens were painted as protectors of morality, often tied to religion, virtue, and divine order. Their very presence was meant to inspire purity. But in secret, the darker urges of the human soul, lust, domination, cruelty, found expression. And unlike commoners, who might face condemnation or punishment for such acts. Queens operated behind the impenetrable shield of royal privilege. To question them was treason. To resist them was death. Our queen understood this power well. She knew the myth of the noble queen was her armor, the story that shielded her from suspicion. To her people, she was untouchable, a woman blessed by divinity. But in reality, she had turned her chambers into an arena where morality was shattered, where men were reduced to pawns, and where her desires reigned supreme. This tension between the myth and the truth is what makes her story so chilling. On one side, the radiant figure celebrated by poets and painters. On the other, the private tyrant who wielded power not with grace but with unspeakable indulgence. History rarely dares to expose such contradictions because they destabilize the comforting narratives of monarchy. But tonight, we peel back the curtain and confront the truth. The queen you are about to meet was not the noble figure etched into legend. She was something else entirely. A woman who shattered every expectation, who manipulated the myth of royalty to hide her darkest hungers. Her story forces us to ask, how much of history has been dressed in silks to conceal the bloodstains underneath? Because while society adored the portrait of the noble queen, the slaves who were summoned into her chambers knew a very different reality, one drenched in fear, exploitation, and horror. And it is their forgotten voices, not the polished legends, that will reveal who she truly was. Every empire has its foundations, some built on stone, some on gold, and some, like the one in our story, built on flesh. Behind the towering palaces, gilded thrones, and opulent ceremonies, there existed a system that reduced human beings to mere commodities. Slavery was not an unfortunate byproduct of this kingdom. It was its lifeblood, woven into every level of society, from the economy to the private chambers of its rulers. To understand the queen's infamous night, the night she summoned 100 slaves into her bed, one must first understand the world that made it possible. This was not the act of a lone woman consumed by depravity. It was the inevitable result of a system where human dignity had long been stripped away, where bodies were bought and sold with the same casualness as spices, silks, or jewels. In the markets of the capital, the trade of flesh was as visible as the trade of grain. Men, women, and even children stood in lines, their bodies examined, their strength tested, their beauty priced. Skin tone, youth, and physical perfection determined value more than character or humanity. The empire's elite saw in them not souls but investments, tools for labor, ornaments for vanity, playthings for desire. For the wealthy, amassing slaves was as much a display of status as constructing a palace or funding an army. The more slaves one owned, the greater the aura of power. But while most slaves worked in kitchens, fields, or mines, a select few were chosen for a more intimate role, to serve in the private pleasures of the ruling class. These were the most prized possessions, hand-picked for their beauty, trained in the arts of seduction, and stripped of any identity beyond servitude. They were not seen as men and women but as extensions of their master's appetite. It was in this world that the queen's desires found fertile ground. The palace itself was an ecosystem of flesh. Every corridor whispered with stories of servants who vanished into chambers and never returned. Eunuchs patrolled the halls, ensuring obedience, enforcing silence, and protecting the secrets of their rulers. For the slaves inside, existence was a paradox. They lived in the shadow of luxury yet carried the weight of despair. They dressed the queen, bathed her, entertained her, but they knew that at any moment, their bodies could be claimed in ways beyond their control. This dehumanization was systemic, sanctioned by both culture and law. Religion, twisted to justify exploitation, declared slaves as the natural property of their masters. Philosophers spoke of hierarchies in which some were born to rule and others to serve. And history's chroniclers, paid by the crown, rarely dared to question this order. To speak against it was treason, and treason often ended with chains, torture, or execution. Thus, the institution of slavery flourished not in shadows but in full daylight, legitimized and glorified as part of the empire's grandeur. When foreign ambassadors visited, they marveled at the palace's magnificence, rarely noting the silent rows of slaves who made it possible. The empire presented itself as a beacon of culture and sophistication, while its foundations were built upon the suffering of countless nameless men and women. For the queen, this system was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it reinforced her majesty, surrounding her with attendants who treated her as divine. On the other, it gave her absolute license to indulge every desire without question. If she demanded silk, it was delivered. If she demanded jewels, they were fetched. And if she demanded flesh, bodies in the dozens, her court obeyed without hesitation. Here lies the chilling truth. The queen's infamous night was not an aberration but the pinnacle of what this society had enabled. She did not have to coerce her attendants to provide her with 100 slaves. They complied because the system normalized such acts. To them, filling her chambers with human bodies was no different than filling them with wine or music. The psychological effect of this culture cannot be overstated. When people are reduced to property, their pain ceases to matter. Their screams are muffled by walls, their tears absorbed into the marble floors. Those who watched such horrors unfold often told themselves it was the natural order, that slaves existed for the pleasure of their rulers. This mentality numbed consciences and silenced compassion. Even the slaves themselves, over time, were forced to internalize this belief, some breaking under the weight of it, others finding numbness as their only survival. And so the queen thrived in a world that rewarded her indulgence and punished anyone who dared resist. She wore the mask of sanctity in public, the noble queen of myth, but in private, she transformed into the embodiment of the system's darkest truths. Her chambers became a theater of domination, where the myth of divine queenship was shattered and the reality of power as raw exploitation was laid bare. The tragedy, however, is not merely in the queen's choices. It lies in the silence of those around her, the courtiers who enabled her, the laws that protected her, the culture that applauded her majesty while ignoring the blood and tears that fed it. Without this complicity, her excesses could never have reached such horrifying heights. When we look at her story now, centuries later, it is tempting to see it as an isolated scandal, one woman's monstrous appetite. But to do so is to overlook the machinery that made it possible. Her acts were not born from a vacuum. They were cultivated in a world where human lives were disposable currency, where flesh itself was a commodity. This is why the Queen's tale endures not only as a shocking anecdote but as a mirror to an entire civilization. It forces us to confront how power corrupts, how privilege blinds, and how societies can normalize horrors until they appear mundane. The night she summoned 100 slaves into her bed was not merely a spectacle of lust. It was the logical conclusion of a kingdom that built its greatness on exploitation. And so, as we step deeper into this tale, remember, the queen may be its central figure, but behind her stands an entire empire complicit in her crimes. The story of her night of horror is also the story of a culture that allowed, even celebrated, the transformation of human beings into objects of pleasure. This was not just her darkness. It was the darkness of an entire kingdom built on flesh. To understand the night when 100 lives were summoned into a queen's chamber, we must first step back into the story of the woman herself. Her rise was not inevitable. She was not born with the crown on her head, nor did the world conspire to hand her power without resistance. Hers was a climb filled with shadows, a journey through court politics, personal betrayals, and a relentless ambition that left no room for mercy. From the earliest days of her childhood, she was marked by two qualities that set her apart: resilience and hunger. Born into the royal family, she was surrounded by privilege, yet it was not a privilege free of pain. Royal households were crucibles of suspicion and rivalry. Brothers turned against brothers, mothers schemed against their own sons, and young daughters like her were pawns in the dangerous games of succession. She learned early that affection was fragile and that survival depended on calculation. As a girl, she was praised for her intelligence and charm, but these were double-edged gifts. Every compliment came with envy, every smile with hidden resentment. By her teenage years, she had already seen servants executed for rumors and cousins poisoned in the silent corridors of the palace. In such an atmosphere, innocence could not last. She discovered that to thrive in this court meant learning to read faces like maps, to know when a smile concealed a dagger, and when silence spoke louder than words. It was in this furnace that her ruthlessness was forged. She did not cry when rivals fell. She observed. She studied how power shifted with a death, how rumors could be as lethal as swords, and how loyalty was a currency spent and discarded with ease. By the time she reached womanhood, she had already mastered the art of watching, waiting, and striking when the moment was right. Yet, for all her ambition, her path was still constrained by the expectations placed upon women of her era. She was told her purpose was marriage, that her worth would be measured by the alliance she secured and the heirs she produced. But she refused to be a pawn in the games of men. Instead, she discovered a weapon uniquely hers, one that even kings underestimated: the power of seduction. From whispers in court records and fragments in chronicles, we know she quickly grasped how to wield her beauty as a tool. But unlike others who relied on charm alone, she combined allure with calculation. She could smile and disarm, but she could also terrify with a single glance. She learned how to make others desire her not only physically but politically, crafting an aura of inevitability around herself. To resist her was to risk being cast aside. To serve her was to taste proximity to power. This duality, the ability to enchant and intimidate, became her defining strategy. She did not hesitate to use it on noblemen, advisors, or even those closest to her own family. Each conquest was not merely about lust. It was about establishing dominance. She understood that in a world ruled by men, to control desire was to control destiny. But seduction alone was never enough. Fear had to accompany it. She began to cultivate an image that oscillated between goddess and executioner. For those who pleased her, she offered unimaginable rewards: positions of influence, wealth, or the fleeting favor of her smile. For those who betrayed her or simply failed to satisfy her ambition, punishment was swift and merciless. Rumors spread of men mysteriously vanishing after falling out of her graces, of rivals reduced to whispers of what they once were. Her rise was not linear. There were moments when she was pushed to the margins of court life, overshadowed by others, but each setback became a lesson. She learned patience, that power gained too quickly could be lost just as fast. Instead of rushing, she built her foundation quietly, cultivating allies among the eunuchs, the guards, and the lower servants. These were the invisible hands of the palace, the people who saw everything yet were rarely noticed. By winning their loyalty, she secured eyes and ears in every corner of the court. Her ambitions crystallized when she caught the attention of the reigning king. Some accounts suggest their union began as a political arrangement. Others claim it was her deliberate conquest. Either way, once she entered his orbit, she ensured she would never be dismissed as a mere ornament. She whispered counsel into his ear, influenced his decisions, and gradually entwined her power with his own. When courtiers questioned her influence, they discovered that the king's affection was not merely romantic but dangerous. He would defend her with ferocity. It was at this stage that the darker side of her nature began to flourish openly. Secure in her position, she no longer needed to hide her appetite for control. Her enemies were publicly humiliated, sometimes executed under charges conveniently fabricated to remove them. Her allies were rewarded lavishly, binding them to her cause. The people began to whisper not only of her beauty but of her cruelty. Yet even cruelty was not the endgame. She wanted to be remembered not just as a queen by marriage but as a ruler in her own right. And to do that, she had to embody something larger than life, a force of nature untouchable and terrifying. This is where her weaponization of sex reached its most strategic form. She used her chambers as extensions of her throne, transforming intimacy into an arena of power. Those summoned to her bed did not merely encounter a lover, they encountered their sovereign. Over time, this merging of desire and dominance became her hallmark. To her subjects, she was the noble queen in silks, blessing the people with ceremonial gestures. To her courtiers, she was the strategist, orchestrating alliances and crushing dissent. But to those who entered her chambers, she was something else entirely. a ruler who demanded absolute submission, who blurred the lines between pleasure and punishment, between ecstasy and terror. This dual identity, saint and predator, ruler and seductress, set the stage for the infamous night that would immortalize her in whispers. A night when her hunger would no longer be satisfied by 1 or 2, but by 100. Her rise, then, was not merely a tale of ambition fulfilled. It was the creation of a persona that thrived on contrasts. The girl who once watched others die in palace corridors, now holding the power of life and death herself. The queen who outwardly embodied elegance, yet inwardly craved domination. Her story up to this point was a prelude, a gathering storm. And when that storm finally broke, it would consume lives in a spectacle so shocking, so unimaginable, that history itself would try to erase it. But the echoes remain, in fragments of chronicles, in forbidden tales whispered through generations, reminders of the queen who rose not only to rule, but to terrify. The corridors of the royal palace were never silent, but on that night, the whispers carried a different weight. Servants spoke in hushed tones, eunuchs glanced nervously at one another, and guards shifted uneasily at their posts. Something extraordinary was about to unfold. A command had been issued from the queen's chamber, a command that would stretch the limits of cruelty and excess. Word spread like smoke. 100 slaves were to be summoned before dawn. To the casual eye, it might have seemed like another lavish indulgence from a ruler accustomed to bending reality to her will. But to those who knew the undercurrents of her power, this order felt like a storm warning. No one questioned it, because to question was to court death. The palace machinery went to work. Runners dispatched, slaves gathered, the queen's chambers prepared with silks, incense, and the oppressive aura of expectation. The slaves came from across the empire's holdings. Young men chosen for their beauty, their strength, or merely their availability. Many were frightened. Some were resigned. They had long since learned that their lives were not their own, their bodies' currency to be spent for the whims of those who ruled them. Yet even within that bleak understanding, the scale of this command was staggering. 100 bodies in a single night, an order not of desire, but of domination. As the hour approached, the queen herself emerged from behind her veils, resplendent in garments of deep crimson and gold. Her eyes, lined with kohl, carried a fire that silenced the room. She did not need to raise her voice. The weight of her presence was enough to make hardened guards bow their heads. She moved with the certainty of a deity, as though what was about to happen was not debauchery, but ritual. The first slave was brought forward, trembling, his bare feet silent against the polished floor. For him, this moment was the edge of a blade. Survive and be discarded, or fail and vanish into punishment too brutal to imagine. The queen extended a hand, her jeweled fingers brushing against his face, and the court scribes who later recorded fragments of this tale noted how quickly his fear was consumed by her command. He ceased to be a man. He was now a vessel. But one vessel was not enough. Another was ushered in, then another, until the rhythm became almost mechanical, bodies flowing into her chamber like offerings to a hungry altar. For hours, the procession continued, and with each arrival, the queen's hunger seemed not to wane but to sharpen, and masked as privilege. Their identities were stripped away, replaced by numbers in a sequence, trophies in a macabre collection. Some collapsed from exhaustion, only to be dragged away by guards and replaced instantly by others waiting in the courtyard. The queen demanded continuity, and continuity was provided. Human dignity was not part of the equation. What happened inside those chambers became legend, shrouded in secrecy yet impossible to contain. Some accounts describe the queen reclining on silken cushions, commanding her attendants like a general marshalling troops. Others speak of her laughter echoing through the halls. Not the laughter of joy, but of triumph. The sound of one who knew she had bent 100 souls to her will. The atmosphere was suffocating. Incense thick in the air, sweat and fear mingling with perfume. Cries muffled by music and drums meant to drown out the humanity of the act. But perhaps the most haunting detail lies in what came after. By dawn, Not all who entered her chambers walked out alive. For the queen, the line between indulgence and destruction was thin, and on that night, it snapped. Some slaves were said to have been smothered under the weight of her demands, their bodies discarded like refuse once they had served their purpose. Others were beaten for faltering, punished for failing to meet the impossible standards of her appetite. The survivors emerged broken not only in body, but in spirit. For them, survival was not victory. It was a sentence of memory. They had been witnesses, unwilling participants in a night that stripped away the last fragments of their humanity. And yet, none dared speak openly. The punishment for spreading word of the queen's excesses was death. But whispers, as always, found a way to live. In the years that followed, the event became more than a scandal. It became a symbol of absolute power corrupted beyond recognition. For courtiers, it was a reminder of her untouchable authority. She could command not just armies and treasuries, but lives themselves, reducing them to tools of momentary pleasure. For the empire, it was proof that the institution of slavery had sunk to its most grotesque extreme. Human beings not merely exploited, but devoured by appetite. The queen, for her part, did not deny what happened. In fact, she reveled in it. When whispers reached her ears, she allowed them to spread, for they fed the myth of her dominance. Fear was her crown jewel, and the tale of the night of 100 slaves made her less a monarch and more a legend of terror. She was no longer just a queen. She was an unchallengeable force, a reminder that absolute power leaves no room for morality. Contrast is what makes the story endure. For outside the palace, the people saw her in ceremonial robes, blessing harvests, and presiding over festivals with a smile. To the public, she was the embodiment of grace, wisdom, and divine favor. But behind closed doors, in the shadows of her chamber, she had revealed a truth too horrifying for official chronicles to preserve: that her kingdom was built not on justice or faith, but on flesh. The night of 100 slaves did not just mark an act of excess. It was the climax of a philosophy. It was the living proof that when human beings are reduced to property, there is no limit to how far they can be consumed. For the queen, one night of indulgence affirmed her dominance. For those forced into her presence, it was humiliation, pain, and for some, death. And for history, it became a ghost story, one whispered with awe and disgust, forever reminding us how power, when unchecked, can transform desire into atrocity. This event was not recorded in the polished annals of official history, yet fragments remained, preserved through scandalous rumor, foreign accounts, and the testimony of those who barely survived. It is through these broken pieces that we glimpse the unthinkable. A ruler who treated human lives as toys, who transformed one night into an eternal warning. And it is here, at this chilling center of her reign, that the question emerges. Was this night the peak of her power, or the beginning of her downfall? Because even the most terrifying rulers cannot forever silence the consequences of their own cruelty. The night of 100 slaves might have ended behind closed doors, but its echoes slipped past the palace walls. Power, no matter how absolute, can never fully contain memory. It seeps into the cracks, carried by trembling lips, frightened eyes, and the footsteps of those who survive. What happened in that chamber was not supposed to be known, yet it became impossible to bury. The first layer of witnesses were the guards. Stationed at the great doors, they did not see everything, but they heard enough. The muffled cries, the heavy rhythm of bodies dragged across marble, the bursts of laughter that did not sound like joy but like conquest. Guards were trained to remain silent, to obey without question, but even silence has its limits. Some could not rid themselves of what they heard. In the dead of night, they muttered to one another, speaking of the queen's excess in tones of fear. Then came the servants. Palace servants lived in the shadows, cleaning what others dirted, preparing feasts they would never taste. They moved invisibly, yet they saw everything. On that night, it was they who carried buckets of water to wash the floors, they who gathered torn fabrics, they who caught fleeting glimpses of exhausted men slumped against pillars before being herded away. Their eyes recorded what official scribes never would. Though their tongues were bound by fear, whispers have a way of traveling. In kitchens and courtyards, when they believed no one important was listening, they exchanged fragments of the truth. From these whispers grew stories, and from stories grew legends. Some claimed that none of the slaves survived. Others swore they saw men limp and broken being led out at dawn, their faces hollowed into shells. A few insisted that the queen drank wine as if it were blood, reveling in her triumph. Were these exaggerations? Perhaps. But exaggeration is how oral tales preserve memory when written history chooses silence. The silence of the official records is deafening. Court scribes chronicled every festival, every military campaign, every royal birth and death. Yet on this night, their quills hesitated. The archives are empty of the queen's indulgence, not because it did not happen, but because it was not meant to be remembered. Royal historians were not neutral observers. They were instruments of propaganda. To write down the truth would be to tarnish the crown itself. And so the parchment remained clean, while reality stained the air like smoke. But truth has a way of surviving, even when unwanted. Foreign visitors to the court, diplomats, traders, emissaries, often sensed what was concealed. Some noticed the nervous glances of the servants, the way officials deflected questions, the sudden disappearances of slaves who had once been visible in the palace. A few dared to record what they suspected in private letters sent home, accounts not meant for public view but for the ears of monarchs and ministers abroad. In these scattered testimonies, the outline of the queen's cruelty took shape. One traveler wrote of an unspeakable night where the queen summoned countless young men and none returned whole. Another described the frightened eyes of the palace staff, as if they bore witness to something that could not be spoken. These accounts, though fragmented, aligned too closely with the whispers inside the palace to be dismissed as fantasy. They became the threads historians centuries later would grasp, weaving together the dark tapestry of what official records tried to erase. Yet, the contradictions between rumor and truth became part of the story itself. Some versions painted the queen as a vampire-like figure who devoured men's lives. Others portrayed her as a tragic figure, enslaved to her own insatiable hunger. Both images served a purpose. They made sense of the incomprehensible. Because how else could ordinary people explain a ruler who turned 100 human beings into disposable objects of pleasure? Among the common people beyond the palace walls, the story spread like wildfire. It was retold in taverns, whispered in markets, reshaped by each tongue that carried it. For some, it was a tale of warning, proof of the dangers of unchecked power. For others, it was a kind of dark entertainment, a forbidden story too shocking to resist repeating. Parents warned daughters of the queen's cruelty, while rebels used the story to fuel anger against the ruling class. The tale became both fear and weapon. The queen herself seemed aware of these whispers, and rather than stamp them out, she allowed them to linger. To silence them entirely would mean acknowledging them. But to let them grow unchecked turned them into a kind of myth, one that magnified her aura of terror. She understood that fear does not require facts. It thrives on shadows. As long as her people believed she was capable of the unimaginable, she remained untouchable. Still, there were those who could not endure silence. A handful of survivors, slaves who managed to live through that night, carried the truth within them. Their tongues were bound by fear, but their eyes told the story. Years later, some of their children and grandchildren would recount vague fragments of what their ancestors endured. These were not polished chronicles but broken confessions, handed down in secret. They are fragile memories, yet they complete the picture that official archives left blank. This duality, silence in the records, whispers among the people, is what allowed the story of the queen to endure. History often survives not in ink, but in rumor. It survives in the frightened laughter of servants, in the shaking hands of guards, in the careful words of foreign emissaries, and in the stories that parents told children when warning them about rulers who seemed like gods but acted like monsters. The Queen's night of horror lives on not because it was written down in stone, but because it was too terrible to forget. The witnesses could not speak openly, but their whispers were enough to carve a scar into memory. And sometimes, Scars tell history more honestly than chronicles ever could. And so the tale of one queen and 100 slaves passed through generations. Half history, half legend, but wholly unforgettable. Even today, it raises the same haunting question. How much of what we know about the past is truth, and how much is whispered fear that no one dared to write? The night of 100 slaves might have ended in silence, but silence was never enough to secure a throne. In the aftermath, the queen understood that the true danger did not come from what had happened behind her doors, but from those who had seen too much, heard too much, or whispered too freely. Power, after all, is not only in the act. It is in the control of memory, in bending people to believe that what they saw could either be denied or punished into oblivion. Her first move was swift and brutal. A handful of slaves who faltered during the ordeal, men who collapsed or resisted, were dragged into the courtyard the next day. Their punishment was not private. It was theatrical. The queen ensured that those who served her would watch as these men were beaten, mutilated, or executed. Not for what they failed to do, but for daring to show weakness in her presence. In that moment, the line between punishment and performance blurred. She was sending a message. Obedience was survival and hesitation was death. The guards who had stood near her chamber doors did not escape suspicion either. Loyalty in the palace was always tenuous, and she suspected that whispers would travel fastest through those entrusted with her security. To remind them of their place, she staged purges. A few were demoted, others imprisoned, and at least one was executed under fabricated charges of betrayal. The execution was public, meant to etch terror into the minds of the living. The message was unmistakable. Even those sworn to protect her were not beyond her wrath. Servants, too, were brought under her gaze. They were the invisible machinery of the palace, and their whispers were dangerous precisely because they moved unnoticed. The queen turned her cruelty into policy. Servants suspected of gossiping were whipped, branded, or disappeared entirely. Those who displayed absolute obedience, however, were rewarded with trinkets or small promotions, turning fear into a currency she could spend. Slowly, she constructed a culture where silence was more valuable than truth, and loyalty was born not of devotion but of terror. But fear alone cannot sustain a kingdom. The queen was not content with suppressing memory. She twisted it into spectacle. At court, she spun narratives that painted herself not as a predator, but as a divine being whose appetites were beyond mortal judgment. She likened her actions to rituals, implying that those who served her body served the empire itself. Courtiers, desperate to survive, echoed her words, turning atrocity into theology. What had been an act of cruelty became cloaked in the language of destiny. And yet, beyond the palace walls, unease began to grow. Merchants, travelers, and even lower-ranking nobles whispered of her excesses. The people, who once saw her as a figure of elegance and divine authority, now looked at her with a mixture of awe and dread. Rumors of executions, midnight punishments, and vanishing servants painted her not as a benevolent queen but as a tyrant who devoured her own household. This unease did not yet transform into open rebellion, but it festered, like a wound hidden beneath layers of silk. Inside the palace, the queen devised crueler games to reinforce her supremacy. She began to orchestrate what some later called trials of loyalty. Courtiers were summoned without warning and forced to prove their obedience in humiliating ways. From kneeling for hours before her throne to offering up their own servants as sacrifices to her whims. Those who complied were temporarily safe. Those who hesitated found themselves stripped of titles, wealth, or life. These punishments were not random. They were carefully chosen to remind every subject that survival depended entirely on her will. She also weaponized paranoia. By planting false rumors and watching how they spread, she discovered who spoke too freely and who remained silent. Betrayal became inevitable because she engineered it. When someone fell into her trap, she punished them with such cruelty that others dared not even think of disobedience. Her palace was not just a residence. It became a stage for fear, where every gesture, every word, every silence could mean life or death. Beyond the court, her policies grew harsher. Taxes were raised, punishments for minor crimes became brutal, and dissent was crushed with ferocity. The people might not have known the full truth of the Night of 100 Slaves, but they felt its shadow. It was as if the cruelty of that evening had seeped into the empire itself, transforming governance into domination. The queen had crossed a threshold. She no longer ruled through respect or divine right, but through raw, unfiltered terror. Still, unease has a way of breeding resistance. Among foreign envoys, her reputation became both fascination and warning. Some saw her as a marvel of unchecked authority, while others reported her excesses back to their kings with alarm. Within her empire, whispers hardened into resentment. Stories of punishments circulated alongside stories of her indulgences, creating a portrait not of a noble ruler but of a monster in silks. And yet, the queen embraced this darkness. She knew fear could last longer than love, and she craved permanence. To her, terror was not a flaw in governance. It was the purest expression of it. She believed that as long as people trembled at her name, her throne would remain unshaken. In the short term, she was right. Her punishments silenced her enemies, her power games destroyed potential rivals, and her aura of cruelty became her strongest shield. But power maintained through fear alone always carries a hidden cost. The same punishments that silenced dissent also bred hatred. The same spectacles that displayed her dominance also revealed her insecurities. Each execution, each humiliation, each disappearance added to a growing weight of resentment that the palace walls could not contain forever. In her pursuit of absolute control, the queen mistook silence for stability. What she failed to see was that fear, while effective, is also fragile. The punished may vanish, but their memory lingers. The silenced may bow their heads, but their whispers survive. And beyond the gilded halls of her court, her subjects began to wonder how long a throne built on pain could stand before it collapsed under the weight of its own cruelty. Her punishments had reinforced her dominance, yes, but they also planted the seeds of her eventual downfall. Because when a ruler turns power into a game of terror, there is only one possible end. The moment when the people, no longer afraid, decide to play their own game. History is written not only by victors, but by those who choose what to remember and what to forget. The tale of the queen who summoned 100 slaves in a single night survives not because it was carefully documented in official annals, but because fragments escaped the grasp of suppression. Those fragments, scattered across traveler diaries, censored chronicles, and whispered oral traditions, form a puzzle both tantalizing and terrifying. The first hints appear in the diaries of foreign envoys. Men sent to negotiate trade or alliances often kept private records, never intended for official publication. Within these yellowed pages, there are cryptic lines: "The queen's indulgences surpass imagination," or 100 souls summoned to her chamber, not all returned. These writings, buried in archives and libraries far from her empire, lack detail but carry the ring of fear. They reveal not polished observations but shocked reactions, as if the authors themselves could not believe what they had witnessed or overheard. Censorship, however, is what defines the story. In the official records of the empire, chronicles that list festivals, taxes, wars, and coronations, there is no mention of the Night of 100 Slaves. The silence is glaring. Historians of later generations, bound by duty to glorify their rulers, erased what they could not justify. The scribes knew what had occurred, but their ink was not free. They bent their quills to paint the queen as a beacon of virtue, draping her sins beneath layers of ceremony. Yet absence speaks as loudly as presence. Why do entire years of the queen's reign pass in unnerving silence in certain chronicles? Why are entire scrolls missing from royal archives, their absence explained away as accidents of time? The erasures themselves are evidence, a deliberate attempt to cover a wound too grotesque to display. Suppression is not denial. It is the shadow that proves something once stood in the light. Meanwhile, underground sources refused to stay quiet. Rebel pamphlets, songs whispered in markets, and stories passed from servant to servant told the tale with brutal clarity. In these accounts, the queen was not a sovereign but a predator. They described her chambers as slaughterhouses, her hunger as demonic. Of course, these sources exaggerated, layering horror upon horror. But exaggeration has its purpose. When truth is forbidden, the imagination steps in, ensuring that what rulers attempt to silence becomes even darker in memory. Mainstream historians, centuries later, faced the dilemma of these conflicting accounts. Some dismissed the story as scandalous rumor, arguing that foreign envoys and rebel whispers distorted events to smear the queen's reputation. Others cautiously acknowledged that something must have happened. Perhaps not 100 slaves, but a smaller number, magnified over time into myth. Yet such arguments reveal a reluctance to confront what history often shows us: that rulers, when given unchecked power, commit acts that defy comprehension. This tension between evidence and suppression is what gives the tale its haunting weight. On one side, the silence of official chronicles insists on dignity, control, and the image of a queen untarnished. On the other, the scattered fragments, the diaries, the whispers, the underground tales scream of indulgence and horror. Which side do we believe? The polished parchment crafted to protect power, or the raw, trembling words of those who risked everything to speak? The deeper question is why such acts are so often erased. It is not only about protecting one queen's legacy. It is about preserving the illusion of nobility itself. If a queen, the supposed mother of her people, could summon and discard 100 human beings in a single night, then the entire facade of royal virtue collapses. Monarchs depend on myths of wisdom, grace, divine blessing. A truth like this would shatter the foundation of monarchy itself. And so it was buried. But burial does not equal death. The fragments survive because memory clings to trauma. Even when ink refuses to tell the story, scars in the collective conscience keep it alive. Each rumor, each suppressed line in a foreign diary, each gap in the archives whispers louder than the chronicles of glory. Together, they form a mosaic not of certainty, but of inevitability. Something happened, something terrible enough to make history itself flinch. And so we arrive at the question that chills more than any detail. How much of what we know about history is true, and how much is curated illusion? How many horrors have been erased from official record, leaving us only with sanitized portraits of kings and queens who smiled in public but destroyed in private? The Queen's Night of 100 Slaves is not merely a story of indulgence and cruelty. It is a case study in the war between memory and suppression. The truth is neither fully preserved nor fully lost. It lives in the uneasy space between fact and rumor, between record and silence. And perhaps that is what makes it so powerful. For in the end, it is not only a story about what one queen did, it is a story about what history tried to hide and what it could not. Every empire built on fear eventually discovers that terror is a brittle foundation. For years, the queen had believed that her cruelty was her strength, that punishments and indulgences kept her throne secure. But the very tactics that expanded her power also sowed the seeds of her ruin. Her reign began to unravel not with a single blow, but with a slow corrosion, the quiet withdrawal of loyalty, the simmering of hatred, the inevitability of betrayal. Inside the palace, her appetite for dominance had exhausted even her closest allies. Ministers who once praised her now lived in constant dread of her whims. Nobles who had bowed in submission began to conspire in shadows, realizing that proximity to the queen was not a privilege but a death sentence waiting to be delivered. Her chambers, once symbols of her authority, had become symbols of danger. Every courtier knew that survival meant keeping their distance. But in a monarchy, distance from the throne is death in another form. Her people, too, grew restless. The stories of her excesses, carried on whispers and travelers' tongues, reached villages and towns that once adored her. Tax collectors found doors slammed in their faces. Farmers cursed her name as they starved under heavier levies meant to fund her lavish displays of power. Fear may silence servants, but hunger cannot be gagged. Slowly, rebellion stirred among those who had nothing left to lose. Foreign rulers, once intimidated by the aura of her cruelty, began to see weakness. Reports of unrest trickled across borders, and ambitious neighbors recognized opportunity. Armies that had once hesitated to face her forces now gathered strength, convinced that the empire was rotting from within. To the outside world, her power looked unshakable. But behind the gilded gates, cracks widened daily. Then came betrayal, the inevitable fate of every tyrant who rules through fear. The queen had always prided herself on sniffing out conspiracies, on keeping her enemies guessing. But paranoia has a cost. She had executed loyal advisors on mere suspicion, alienating the very people who might have protected her. In the end, her undoing came not from the masses she despised, but from the hands of those closest to her. One version of the tale tells of generals who turned against her, weary of losing soldiers in wars fought for her vanity. Another whispers of a lover-turned assassin, someone who had once been summoned to her chambers but could no longer stomach her cruelty. Still another insists it was her own family, nephews and cousins eager to rid themselves of her shadow, who betrayed her to foreign invaders. The details differ, but the pattern is the same. When fear is the only bond between ruler and subject, the first chance at escape becomes irresistible. Her end, when it came, was as brutal as her reign. Some chronicles claim she was seized during an uprising, dragged from her silken bed, and forced to face the people she had tormented. They describe stones hurled at her, curses spat in her face, until the crowd tore her apart in a frenzy of vengeance. Others tell of poison slipped into her wine, a quiet but fitting end for one who had poisoned her court with terror. But the most chilling version speaks of disease. It says the queen's body, so accustomed to indulgence, rotted from within. Her skin erupted in sores, her once commanding voice reduced to pitiful whispers, her chamber emptied of servants too fearful to touch her. In this version, death came not by sword or poison, but by the slow decay of her own flesh, as though the universe itself delivered poetic justice, turning her hunger for bodies into her own wasting corpse. Regardless of which ending is true, one detail unites every account. She died alone. The woman who commanded hundreds with a glance, who filled palaces with slaves and courtiers desperate for her favor, found herself abandoned in her final moments. Power built on fear dissolves the moment fear is gone, and in her dying hour, no one remained to mourn her. The aftermath of her fall was swift and merciless. Her name was stricken from monuments, her image erased from paintings, her deeds buried under layers of propaganda. Successors painted her as a cautionary tale, a ruler too consumed by excess to embody the dignity of the crown. Official records sanitized her reign, transforming her from a monster into a ghost. But erasure, like fear, never lasts forever. Whispers persisted, and her story became more haunting in its suppression. For the people, her downfall was both relief and warning. Relief because the shadow that had darkened their lives had lifted. Warning because they had learned firsthand how unchecked power could twist a crown into a weapon. Her cruelty became legend, her night of 100 slaves a story retold for generations, each version darker than the last. Her fall was not only the collapse of one queen's reign, it was the collapse of the illusion that cruelty could be eternal. No empire, no matter how gilded, can endure when its foundation is built on humiliation and blood. Her lust for dominance alienated allies, created enemies, and invited rebellion. In the end, the throne she fought so hard to secure became her prison, and her legacy became the very horror she tried to bury. This is the twisted justice of history. Those who believe themselves gods are reminded, sooner or later, that they are mortal. And those who build kingdoms on flesh will find their monuments crumbling into dust, while their names survive only as curses whispered in the dark. Her reign ended, her body decayed, and her name was struck from the official scrolls. But legends have longer lives than kings or queens. What the scribes erased, the whispers preserved. The night of 100 slaves, the punishments that followed, and her merciless downfall did not vanish with her corpse. Instead, they slipped into the bloodstream of history like a hidden poison, shaping how generations thought about power, lust, and fear. Hers became not a celebrated story, but a taboo, a memory too foul to teach, too vivid to forget. In the centuries that followed, storytellers carried her name only in hushed tones. Parents used her tale to frighten disobedient children. Behave, or the queen will take you to her chambers. Rebels invoked her as a symbol of tyranny, proof that rulers cloaked in silks were capable of monstrosities worse than their enemies. Priests turned her story into sermons, warning that unchecked desire led to damnation. And yet, despite the attempts to moralize her life, the truth slipped through, not as a parable but as a wound. The legend became a mirror of human fascination. On one hand, people recoiled from the horror, the dehumanization, the indulgence, the sheer waste of life. On the other hand, they could not look away. The grotesque always lingers longer in memory than the noble. Festivals and victories fade, but nightmares endure. She became immortal not because she inspired devotion, but because she inspired fear. Centuries later, when monarchies were romanticized in paintings and plays, her shadow stood as the counterpoint. In gilded portraits, queens were depicted as mothers of nations, symbols of wisdom and elegance. Poets compared them to doves and roses, embodiments of purity. But whispered alongside those verses were darker songs. Ballads of the queen who consumed 100 men in one night, whose bed was a graveyard of flesh. She was the grim reminder that behind every jeweled crown could lurk appetites too terrible to reveal. This contrast still shapes how we view royalty today. Think of the modern obsession with kings and queens in films and television. They are draped in glamour, portrayed as tragic lovers or wise rulers navigating impossible burdens. We binge-watch dramas that elevate their grandeur, seduced by the idea of noble blood. Yet, beneath the velvet costumes and carefully lit palace halls, history tells a different story. One where crowns concealed cruelty and rulers treated their subjects as expendable toys. The Queen of 100 Slaves is not simply an outlier. She is a reminder that the fantasy of nobility often masks the reality of monstrosity. What makes her story even more haunting is not merely what she did, but what it revealed. Power did not corrupt her suddenly, like a poison seeping into pure water. Power gave her permission to express what had always been within her: an appetite for control, a hunger for domination, a willingness to erase human dignity for her own satisfaction. In her, power did not create the monster. It unveiled it. The legacy of fear she left behind was not confined to the palace or the empire she once ruled. It stretched across cultures and generations, becoming part of the universal cautionary tales about power. Scholars, when stumbling upon fragments of her story, debated endlessly whether the Night of 100 Slaves truly happened. But for the people who whispered her tale, truth was almost irrelevant. What mattered was the lesson. Rulers are dangerous not because they are divine, but because they are human, and humanity is capable of unfathomable cruelty when given unchecked control. Even today, her memory surfaces in strange places. In dusty archives, historians uncover travelers' diaries that hint at her excesses. In folklore, storytellers preserve her as a cautionary ghost, a warning that beauty and elegance can cloak horror. In the subconscious of societies still wrestling with questions of authority, her story becomes archetype. The tyrant who consumed, the queen who devoured, the monarch whose throne was built on bones. Why does her tale persist? Because it answers a question we are too afraid to ask directly. What happens when desire is given no boundaries, when power is given no restraints? It is easier to believe in the fantasy of noble rulers, easier to crown kings and queens in our imaginations as paragons of order and virtue. But her shadow insists on the darker truth, that the crown magnifies the soul, and if the soul is monstrous, the reign will be monstrous too. This is why her legacy is not celebrated in textbooks but endures in whispers. Official history seeks order and pride. Unofficial memory clings to trauma and terror. She does not fit the polished narrative of royal elegance. Instead, she belongs to the darker archive of humanity, the archive of fires, massacres, betrayals, and cruelties that official pens tried to cross out but could not erase. She remains in the category of forbidden knowledge, where fascination and revulsion intertwine. The Queen's story also forces us to reconsider the way we consume history itself. When we watch movies about royalty or scroll through glamorous depictions of palaces, are we not engaging in the same selective memory as the court scribes? We elevate the beautiful fragments, ignoring the grotesque realities hidden behind them. We want to believe in crowns as symbols of stability, love, and wisdom. But her legacy interrupts that fantasy, whispering, "Look closer. The crown is not always gold. Sometimes it is a mask hiding blood." And so the story of the queen who slept with 100 slaves in a single night survives as both history and myth, warning and temptation. It tempts us because it exposes the forbidden, the obscene, the unimaginable. It warns us because it proves that unimaginable horrors are not only possible, but real. Her name may be gone, her empire dissolved, her monuments forgotten. Yet the fear she inspired remains her most enduring monument, etched not in stone, but in memory. People still lean in closer when her story is told, their voices dropping to whispers, as if afraid she might still be listening. That is the true measure of her power. Centuries after her death, she still commands silence, still compels fascination, still lingers as a phantom at the edge of history. Her story concludes not with glory, but with a reflection that chills more deeply than any detail of her life. Power doesn't always corrupt. Sometimes, it reveals the darkness already within.